Fog lay over the Ponyri rail embankment like wet wool, thick enough to mute the world and thin enough to let sound travel. Hannes Kappler drove his Ferdinand at a crawl, because speed in July black soil snapped trackpins and stranded men. The vehicle's weight pressed water out of the ground and left it shining on either side of the tracks, a dark mirror that reflected nothing but grey. The left track rolled over a half-buried German helmet and crushed it flat with a dull cough. The vibration came up through the floor plates and into Hannes's teeth. Dietrich eased off the throttle without being told, and that tiny hesitation stretched the seconds in the open as if someone had pulled them by hand. On the radio net, staff could still talk about routes and schedules. Out here, a second was a physical object you carried. A shell burst ahead with a flat concussion that slapped dirt against the front plate. Chunks of wet earth slid down the armor like heavy rain. Hannes leaned into the periscope and tried to make the white nothing of fog into angles and lanes. He could take a bearing from the sound, but the fog erased depth. His orders came out narrow and cautious. Hold, edge, listen. Commands that kept them alive while they slowly surrendered choice. Hans kept his hands near the breech as if the gun were a stove he had to feed. He watched Hannes's posture instead of the fog, and spoke like a man stating a mechanical law. "Herr Leutnant," he said low, "this machine has no machine gun. Without infantry, it's a coffin with a good lid." The words settled into the fighting compartment and stayed there, as persistent as the smell of warm oil. Static chewed at the radio, then words emerged in clipped map language. Schwere Panzerjäger Regiment, 656, Abteilung 653. The net repeated the plan they had been living on since Citadel began, then replaced it with a single instruction that tasted different. Withdraw to the second line. Fill the gap. Immediate. A second transmission carried the reason in the same dry tone used for ammunition counts. Kutuzov has begun. Oral is bleeding. Model wants the heavy hunters pulled back before they are cut off. The offensive vocabulary did not disappear, but it suddenly sounded like habit, like the last few minutes of an argument everyone already knew they had lost. Hannes answered with a formal acknowledgement because discipline was easiest before choices hardened. The handset went quiet for a beat, and inside the hull the crew waited for the sound that mattered most, the change in engine note that meant turning west. Dietrich did not move the levers yet. He waited too, as if the machine itself wanted to know which story it belonged to. On the smeared map board bolted to the hull, Ponyri Station was a small square beside a line of track and a name written in pencil by someone who had never smelled this mud. The withdrawal route was a clean line on paper. Here it was a corridor that could be swept by any gun with elevation, a funnel bordered by soft ground that would swallow any vehicle foolish enough to leave the embankment. Before the push, staff officers had spoken of pinching the salient and restoring direction, as if direction were a lever you could pull. Hannes had believed enough to drive forward because belief was part of being an officer and because new machines demanded faith to justify their cost. The Ferdinand's gun had been sold to them as a long arm that could cut through Soviet armor from distances that felt safe. Nobody in those briefings lingered on what happened when the enemy moved close and the machine had no teeth for it. Now the same ground that resisted advance would resist retreat, and the timetable on the radio sounded like a man ordering the tide to turn. Hannes did not argue with the strategic fact. He argued with the private fact that lived under his skin, behind his right eye, where a thin scar ran into the corner like a crack in glass. He touched the scar through his glove. Pressure pulled up a memory he kept like a splinter. A tower-turreted Soviet heavy appearing out of smoke, the slow punch of a huge gun, the sound of metal folding where men had been. He had lived through it by inches, and the inches had cost him everyone else. Survival had felt less like victory than like misfiled paperwork. The burned photograph in his breast pocket still carried those faces, edges blackened as if fire had tried to erase them and failed. He kept it close enough to warm with his body, evidence and punishment in one. Some men carried lucky charms. Hannes carried proof that command could be a death sentence, even when it followed doctrine. A gap opened in the fog for the length of a breath. A shape rose above the sunflowers like a watchtower. Boxy turret, short, thick gun, the silhouette of a demolisher repurposed into a hunter. Hannes's pulse slowed, not with calm but with recognition that felt like cold water. The shape did not belong to German doctrine. It belonged to a year of sleepless nights. White paint on the turret side formed two blunt digits, 150, applied too boldly to be camouflage and too carefully to be random. Hannes checked the spacing, the run of paint at one corner, the way the number sat on the steel as if someone had wanted it seen. He did not need anyone to confirm what his eyes already insisted. The KV-2 fired, and recoil rocked the turret like a slow punch. Beyond the embankment, a Panzer III lifted on one side and settled crooked, flames pushing out of its hatches as if the hull had exhaled. The shot was not just killing tanks. It was sweeping the ground men would use to obey the withdrawal order. A rote became a trap the moment a gunner chose it. Dietrich's breathing sped up, and his hands tightened on the steering levers until his knuckles showed pale through grime. Hans shifted a shell on the rack and said nothing. Everyone in the hull could feel the decision forming before it was spoken, because Hannes's stillness had changed. It was the stillness of a man who had found a sentence in a book and could not stop reading it. The radio repeated the route and added a time limit, the voice crisp with impatience. Hannes answered once more, then let the handset hang as if it had burned him. The clock was now inside the compartment, ticking in the spaces between engine whine and distant fire. In a battle like this, time was not measured in minutes. It was measured in how long it took the enemy to adjust their aim. He pivoted the hull a few degrees to keep the front plate toward the KV's sector. The electric drives complained in a thin, strained note, and the temperature needle climbed a fraction, as if irritated by the extra demand. Even in fog, he could feel the machine's reluctance like a living thing. A shout came from rail-side rubble, thin and broken by distance. Hannes adjusted his periscope toward a collapsed culvert and caught a boot kicking weakly beneath a slab. A messenger in an armband was pinned under concrete, eyes wide with pain and shame, one hand reaching for a leather folder strapped to his chest, as if paper could keep him alive. Hans's coffin warning stayed in Hannes's skull as he cracked the hatch. Fog slapped his face with wet air and churned soil, and automatic fire sounded closer without the radio's chatter to soften it. Exposure had a smell. Damp earth, cordite, and the faint, sweet rot of crushed plants. Hannes climbed out in a crouch and dropped into the mud beside the culvert, because standing was how men died. He hooked the messenger's collar and pulled, feeling concrete scrape cloth and skin. The boy bit down hard enough to bleed rather than scream. Machine gun fire stitched the embankment. Impacts hit wet dirt close enough that Hannes felt them in his boots, close enough that the air seemed to twitch. He dragged the boy to the Ferdinand side and shoved him against armor that was cold and slick with rain. Dietrich reached out from the hatch and hauled the messenger inside the way you haul a man onto a boat in heavy water. As Hannes climbed back, a burst tore his breast pocket open. The waxed paper bundle slipped into the mud without ceremony. He snatched the photograph with bare fingers and came up with mud smeared across the faces until they looked drowned again. He shoved it back inside his jacket and slammed the hatch, sealing fog, smoke, and fear back into steel. His hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from the simple fact that he had just spent seconds on flesh in a place where seconds were lethal. The compartment felt smaller with a fifth man. The messenger, Otto, clutched his leather folder as if it were his ribs, breath shallow from bruising. He was young enough that the war still surprised him. Hannes took the folder without asking and flipped it open under the dim lamp, because paper was the one kind of intelligence you could hold. An order sheet, damp but legible where it mattered. July 12th. Kutuzov, redeploy. Defensive line. Heavy units pulled back to plug a gap. The paper did not argue. It simply stated that the offensive had already started to fold behind them, that the big war was turning regardless of what one vehicle did on one rail bed. Otto tried to speak, perhaps to report, perhaps to plead. His voice shook and stopped. Hannes folded the sheet and did not meet the boy's eyes. He could feel his crew watching him, waiting to see whether saving a messenger meant he still belonged to the army's story, or whether it had been a gesture made before he cut himself loose. The radio hissed again for a position report, then repeated the withdrawal order, as if louder words could change physics. Hannes keyed the transmitter as if to answer, and then stopped. In that pause, he felt the last clean second where turning west would still be obedience, and he felt the heavier truth that obedience would leave 150 sitting on the route like an unanswered question. He turned the tuning knob until the speaker went dead. The silence that followed was physical, like shutting a door on a shouting room. "Forward," he told Dietrich. "Along the rail." The Ferdinand moved, slow and heavy, away from the withdrawal route and toward the Soviet belt, leaving behind the last easy excuse and the last easy way back. With the radio dead, the hull filled with other warnings, the whine of electric drives under load, the clack of couplings, the drip of rainwater through hinges. Hannes began to count those sounds the way he counted rounds, because there was no longer any higher voice to tell him what mattered. Every vibration became a sentence. He kept tight to the rail embankment because it held shape under weight. To the left lay broken stakes, coils of wire, and small wooden posts with faded paint that marked cleared lanes through mines. To the right, the sunflowers gave way to open, black soil that swallowed boots and tires and sometimes tanks when summer rain returned to remind men that the steppe was not flat kindness. Leaving the embankment by a meter could be the difference between movement and burial. Near a ditch sat the twisted frame of a Borg War demolition carrier, its skeletal tracks half sunk and its belly split open. Hannes recognized it from briefings. Remote explosives meant to eat bunkers, often destroyed before they could be used. Its wreckage was a lesson written in iron. Clever machines still died in mud, and plans still bled out in small, ugly failures. Otto sat on an ammunition crate, ribs bruised, eyes trying not to look at the mud on Hannes's hands. Hannes felt the folded order sheet in his pocket and the photograph beneath it, like layered weights. The paper told him the war was turning. The photograph told him he had already been turned long ago. Fog thinned into lanes between trees. Hannes listened more than he looked, because engines carried in damp air and silhouettes lied. He halted for seconds at a time to sort rhythms. A light track set probing, then pausing, then probing again. And somewhere deeper, a heavier cadence dragging unevenly. He built a map in his head from cadence and direction, the way sailors built maps from wind. A lighter diesel rise and fall came close first. Hannes traversed the 88 toward it and waited until a T-34's hull crested a low ridge at a shallow angle. Hans slid an armor-piercing round into the breach with a practiced motion. The breach closed with a clank that sounded like a lock. Hannes fired. The shell struck side armor, and the T-34 slumped into smoke, turret freezing as if the tank had been unplugged. Counterfire answered almost immediately, a Soviet shell snapping into the trees behind them and showering splinters against the rear plate. Bark and dirt rattled on armor like hard rain, and the echo told him the enemy was already correcting. He ordered a short reverse and pivot. Dietrich obeyed, cautious, but the right track slipped and carved a trench in wet soil before catching again. The trench stayed, a dark reminder under the churned surface. Every correction wrote a little more of their story into the ground, and the ground did not forget. Another engine note shifted closer, cautious, cutting and then pausing as if its driver were listening too. Otto, pressed to a vision block despite bruised ribs, caught a flicker between hedgerow gaps and called the direction with a voice that wanted to break but held. Hannes did not thank him. Gratitude made people think they had a choice. The second T-34 nosed around a muddy ditch. Hannes used the pause, fired, and the shell punched through the turret ring with a dull metallic shock. Smoke pushed out of seams. The kill was clean, but the lane was now loud, and loud lanes drew men on foot. It also drew the KV-2's attention, which mattered more. Dietrich reported the temperature needle in the yellow and a hot smell from the left motor housing. Hannes kept the movement light and continuous, refusing to stop long enough for the drives to cool, because he could already hear the infantry. Wet footsteps in reeds, submachine gun chatter closer, small disciplined noises of men moving to place charges. A Ferdinand could shrug off bullets from the front. It could not shrug off men under its belly. The lane opened into a shallow basin where rainwater fed a marshy low, reeds standing like thin spears. Beyond the basin lip, half masked by brush, the box turret rose again. Even streaked with mud, the white digits were legible, 150. Seeing them at this distance felt like a hand closing around Hannes's throat. He checked for the possibility of a decoy, paint too fresh, movement too theatrical. But what he saw was practical. The tank sat in a firing pocket that covered the railbed, exactly where a real hunter would sit to punish movement. The turret's slow micro-adjustments spoke of a crew that had time and patience, not a trap laid for a fool. It was there to kill and survive. Hannes could have aimed for the turret and trusted the PaK-43 to end it cleanly. That would have been the correct decision on a range card. Instead, he aimed low at the left track run, steel meeting mud. He wanted the monster pinned where he could watch it die, not vanish into fog with the war's paperwork to argue over the claim. He wanted certainty, and certainty required control of movement. He fired. Mud and metal burst from the KV-2's track, and the tank lurched and sagged on that side. The machine did not stop entirely, but its posture changed. It had been a tower on legs. Now it was a tower with a limp. The basin suddenly felt smaller, as if both vehicles had stepped into a ring. The KV-2's shotgun flashed. A heavy shell detonated near the basin edge, not to penetrate, but to blind. Fragments stormed the Ferdinand's upper hull. A jagged shard shattered the periscope glass, and the world through it became cracked brightness and smear. Hannes's precious sight picture was gone, replaced by a kaleidoscope of rain and fracture. Dietrich tried to back out. The right track spun, dug, and the hull settled deeper, the trench widening under the same spot. The electric drives rose into strain, turning power into heat instead of motion. The tone of the motors changed from effort to complaint. It sounded like pain, and that sound was contagious. Hannes ordered stop. Silence lasted only a moment before it filled with the sounds he dreaded. Footsteps closer, water squishing, a distant shouted command, then the sharp clatter of a submachine gun. Without a machine gun of their own, every meter the infantry gained was a meter they would have to buy with flesh and explosives. Hans's earlier warning returned as fact. Grenades were all they had left for men close enough to climb. A first bottle shattered on the engine deck and flame licked across wet metal, weak at first, then stronger where fuel residue fed it. Smoke began to seep in through seams and vents, thin as a whisper and then thick enough to taste. Hannes cracked the hatch a hand's width for one throw and one look. Rain and smoke traded places through the slit. Hans lobbed a grenade toward the nearest shadow. The blast thumped wet and close and bodies hit mud. The air outside seemed to recoil. A rifle shot answered immediately, cracking off the hatch rim with a sharp clang. The opening had been measured. Hannes forced himself not to widen it, because widening it was how men died. Another bottle shattered, flame found wiring, and insulation burned with an acrid, sweet smell that made the air feel thick, like breathing through cloth. Dietrich began to cough hard enough that his hands slipped on the controls. Hannes tried to keep his voice steady as he ordered the driver to focus on gauges, because panic did not just kill the panicked man. It killed everyone trapped with him. The driver nodded without looking, the way drowning men nod. Hannes tried to reload the gun, but smoke made his movements clumsy, and the rack was awkward in that cramped space. Hans stayed close, feeding the breach, keeping rhythm even as rifle fire snapped at the hatch rim. Rhythm was the only thing in the compartment that resembled control. Hannes leaned into the slit again, just a fraction, to confirm where the nearest movement had gone. A crack sounded, clean and close. Hannes jerked, as if pulled by a wire from outside, and fell back into the compartment, blood spreading fast across his collar and down his chest. His hands opened and closed once, searching for the breach that was no longer his to feed. Otto froze, staring at Hans's body with the stunned fixation of a boy seeing the war's arithmetic. Hannes grabbed him and forced him back into motion, because shock was another enemy closing distance. Otto's eyes changed as he obeyed. The surprise drained out of them. Something harder moved in. Flame grew stronger, where it found insulation and pooled fuel. Smoke thickened. The air inside the Ferdinand became expensive, each breath shorter than the last. Hannes wiped his hands on the damp order sheet and felt the absurdity of it. A stamped date and a burning hull, paper insisting on redeployment while steel insisted on death. Infantry were close enough now that Hannes could hear their breathing between bursts. He could not see them through shattered optics. He could only read their presence in sound, in impacts on armor, in the way the outside noise tightened around the vehicle like a rope. He ordered Otto out the rear hatch with 2 grenades, because men close enough to climb the deck would end them with a charge under a track. Otto hesitated, then nodded, and slipped out into rain as if stepping off a cliff. Hannes did not tell him he would be okay, because lying would have been cruelty. Blasts flashed through the reeds, one, then another, and the nearest footsteps scattered. Then Otto screamed once, sharp, and went silent. The silence did not mean safety. It meant someone with a rifle had corrected quickly and fired once. Heat climbed, motor housings clicked as metal expanded. The smell of burned insulation became sharp enough to taste. Dietrich's coughing turned wet and slow, his head sagging between breaths as if sleep pulled him down. He tried to inhale deeper and could not, and the lack of air made his hands clumsy on controls that demanded precision. Hannes tried one last minimal reverse because effort was the only dignity left. The right track twitched and stopped as if the mud had gripped it with a hand. An electrical arc snapped behind the bulkhead, blue-white, brief, and then fire found fuel vapor and surged inward, a sudden heat that made the compartment feel smaller again. Dietrich made one strangled inhale that did not complete and went slack in the driver's seat. The driver's compartment fell silent except for the hiss of smoke. Hannes was alone in a burning coffin with 150, still close enough to finish what it had started. Hannes did not move for a beat because movement required belief in outcomes. Flames crackled behind the bulkhead, and heat pressed against his cheeks as if the air were thickening into solid. Another minute, and the ammunition racks would cook off, and whatever ending he imagined would be replaced by an ending chosen by physics. He forced his hands to work. One armor-piercing round remained in the rack, the last clean argument his gun could make. He opened the breech and lifted the shell with both arms, shoulders burning, sliding it home with a shove that scraped metal. His lungs burned too, but he kept the motion smooth because panic turned strength into waste. Traverse power was gone, so he used the manual crank, turning until the gun inched toward the sound outside. Each rotation moved the barrel only a little, and each little movement cost him breath. He cracked the forward hatch a hand's width and used the gap like a prison slit. Rain spattered his face as smoke streamed out and drew air in, a brutal trade that kept him conscious. The KV-2's turret filled the slit like a building coming closer. The white digits were streaked but still legible, still obscene in their certainty. The Soviet tank dragged one side, and its hull aimed at the Ferdinand not for a clean shot but for contact. Ramming did not require optics, only mass and patience. Hannes had no driver to dodge and no room to bargain, so he waited for the one thing he could still control: timing. He watched for the moment the KV-2 stopped correcting and committed to a straight line, believing in impact. When it did, the tank's approach became predictable for a handful of seconds. and predictability was the closest thing to mercy he would get. He fixed on the seam where turret ring met hull side, the intersection of mechanics and armor. He pulled the lanyard. The 88 fired, punching smoke and rain outward in a bright cone. The shell struck and tore into Soviet steel, spitting darker smoke and fragments from the KV-2's flank. The impact was not a clean explosion. It was a tearing, like metal being unstitched. Momentum carried the KV-2 forward another meter, because dead machines still obey momentum. Its damaged track caught in the same mud that held the Ferdinand, and the two hulls met with a grinding impact like freight cars coupling. Steel pressed to steel. The distance Hannes had been hunting collapsed into contact, and contact made the basin feel like a sealed room. A flash from the KV-2's gun tube lit the rain, and the blast struck the Ferdinand's front with a concussive force that did not need penetration. Bolts and flakes of metal tore loose and whipped inside like thrown knives. A fragment cut Hannes's cheek, warm blood mixing with soot on his skin. The shockwave turned his ribs into a single, aching cord. The two tanks settled deeper together, locked at an angle, neither able to move without dragging the other. Through the hatch slit, Hannes saw fog lifting and a pale strip of sun arriving without interest. The rail line lay a few meters away, still running north and south, as if it could carry the war past them. Somewhere beyond it, men would still follow orders and write reports. Here, steel and mud decided what was true. Hannes thought of Hans's coffin warning and of Otto's damp paper, redeploy too late, and understood what he had done with the word precision. He had used it as a way to pretend control when the war's direction belonged to other men. He had not saved anything. He had only made 150 stop, and even that was not a victory so much as a pause carved into the day. His breath came shallow, then shallower. Smoke thickened again as fire found another seam. He kept his eye on the white digits pressed close in the slit of light, not because they offered comfort, but because they were proof that this hunt ended where he could see it. Then the breath did not come at all, and the account closed in heat, mud, and silence,